The first week after moving into the cabin felt like a dream. The place sat on the edge of a wide, calm lake that glimmered in the morning light. I had been searching for a quiet retreat for years, somewhere far from the noise of the city, and when I found this property, it felt like fate. The old wooden porch creaked under my boots, the smell of pine drifted in from the forest, and every evening the sun melted into the water like it had been painted just for me. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on the deck, listening to the gentle splash of fish breaking the surface. It was peaceful, simple, and exactly what I'd wanted. But on my third morning, the calm broke. I was unpacking boxes when I noticed several cars pulling up outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be neighbors coming to introduce themselves. I set down the box and stepped onto the porch, expecting smiles and handshakes. Instead, I saw a small group of people walking briskly toward me, clipboards in hand, faces set in hard lines. At the front of the group was a woman wearing oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat, the kind of look that says she's in charge even before she speaks. Before I could even greet them, she raised her voice. "This lake belongs to the HOA, and you can't use it without permission," she declared. Her tone was sharp, like she'd rehearsed it. I blinked, caught off guard, and asked her what she meant. She introduced herself as the president of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association and quickly rattled off a list of rules about the lake. No swimming without their approval, no fishing without their tags, and no boats unless they issued the pass. Her words tumbled out so fast it was hard to catch them all. I tried to explain that the property I bought included lake access, and that the listing had clearly stated it. She didn't seem to care. "That's not how it works here," she said, glancing back at the others for support. A tall man behind her chimed in, adding that the docks were private property of the HOA, and anyone using them without authorization could be fined. Their confidence was almost amusing, but I stayed quiet for the moment, letting them talk. The truth was, I'd done my homework before buying this place. My lawyer had reviewed every document, every map, and every easement tied to the land. What they didn't seem to know, or maybe didn't care to know, was that my property line extended far into the lake, and the rights to that section had been secured decades ago. In fact, the 3 docks they were so proudly claiming sat directly on my water rights. But instead of blurting that out, I decided to listen. As they continued listing off violations, I hadn't even committed, my curiosity grew. This wasn't a friendly warning. This was a power play. The way they clustered together, the way they kept talking over me, it was clear they were used to getting their way. I could feel the tension in the air, the sort that turns neighbors into enemies if it's not handled carefully. Or, in this case, strategically. I finally interrupted, asking them to show me the exact rule or document that said the lake belonged to them. The woman in the sun hat hesitated for a second before brushing it off. "We don't need to show you anything right now," she said, "but you'll be getting official notices." She seemed convinced that those words alone would scare me into falling in line. I almost smiled. In that moment, I decided not to argue further. Instead, I nodded slowly, thanked them for stopping by, and said I'd look forward to reviewing whatever paperwork they sent. The look on her face told me she didn't expect me to be that calm. She turned to leave, muttering something about new people not understanding how things work here. The group followed her back to the cars, still talking among themselves. After they drove off, I stood on the porch for a long while, looking out over the water. The stillness had returned, but it felt different now, like the lake itself knew trouble had just been stirred. I thought about their confident claims, their certainty that they owned the space in front of my home. I knew it wouldn't be the last time they tried to assert control. And I also knew they were in for a surprise once they learned the truth. That evening, I walked down to the shoreline. The sun was sinking, casting streaks of gold across the water, and the 3 docks stood quiet, their wooden planks glowing in the light. I could hear a faint hum from across the lake, where someone's boat engine was idling. The smell of the water mixed with the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting from somewhere nearby. I took it all in slowly, feeling the weight of the situation settle on my shoulders. Owning this property wasn't just about a view or a vacation spot. It was about rights they clearly didn't think I had. But I did. And if they wanted to challenge that, they were going to have to face more than just my word. I thought about the history of this place, about the old records stored in the county office that proved exactly where my property line was drawn. I thought about the water rights deed that had been signed long before this HOA even existed. By the time the sky turned from gold to deep purple, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront them immediately. Instead, I'd let them dig their own hole. I'd let them send their notices, make their demands, and put their false claims in writing. Because once they did, I'd have everything I needed to push back, not just politely, but with proof they couldn't argue against. The lake was calm again that night, the moon reflecting off the surface like a silver coin. From my porch, I could see the faint outline of the docks in the distance, standing on the water that was, without a doubt, mine to control. They just didn't know it yet. And for now, I was more than fine with keeping it that way. The next morning started off quiet, almost too quiet. The air was still, the lake glassy, and the usual calls of birds from the treeline felt muted. I made my coffee and stepped out onto the porch, half expecting another unannounced visit. Nothing. No cars, no HOA patrol, no voices. But I knew it wouldn't last. People like that didn't just back off after one conversation. By mid-morning, my guess was proven right. A plain white envelope was stuck under my front door mat. No knock, no greeting, just dropped off like some secret warning. I picked it up and opened it slowly. Inside was a neatly typed letter with the HOA logo at the top, listing lake usage violations in bold letters. The list was ridiculous. It claimed I had launched unregistered watercraft. I didn't even own a boat yet. It said I had altered shoreline vegetation. All I'd done was mow the grass along the edge. And of course, it repeated that the docks were private HOA property, and I was trespassing by walking near them. What caught my attention, though, was the line at the bottom. Failure to comply may result in fines up to $500 per incident. That told me everything I needed to know about their motives. This wasn't about rules. It was about control and money. I sat down at the small table inside, sipping my coffee while reading the letter again. They didn't know that their threats weren't going to work. In fact, they didn't even realize they were making a mistake that would help me later. Every false claim they put in writing became part of a trail I could use against them. That afternoon, I decided to take a slow walk around the lake, staying on my own property but making sure I saw everything up close. The 3 docks were as I remembered, old but sturdy, extending far into the water. A couple of small fishing boats were tied to them, rocking gently. I recognized one of the boats from the far side of the lake. It belonged to the tall man from the day before. Interesting. They were quick to tell me I couldn't use the docks, yet they clearly felt entitled to leave their boats there year-round. Halfway along the shore, I saw a few signs nailed to posts. Private HOA property, members only in bold black letters. I noticed something odd. The signs were placed directly in the water zone that I knew, from my deed, was part of my property rights. It was like someone had just assumed the land and water were theirs and planted signs without bothering to check. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures from different angles. Not just of the signs, but of the property lines, the docks, the boats, everything that could be useful later. As I did, a voice called out from the opposite dock. It was the woman in the sun hat again. She shouted something about documenting violations, and that they'd be keeping a close eye on me. I waved, pretending to take it lightly, but every word she yelled was fuel for what I was planning. Back at the cabin, I dug out the folder my lawyer had given me during the purchase. Inside was the gold mine, the official property survey, the water rights documentation, and a detailed map of the lake boundaries. The survey clearly showed that the docks sat on my portion of the water easement. The water rights deed spelled it out in plain language. Exclusive control over any structures built within the designated water zone. In other words, those docks, their pride and joy, were legally under my authority, not theirs. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. They had stormed up to my door claiming I couldn't use the lake, when in reality they were the ones using my water space without permission. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they had probably been doing it for years, completely unaware of the real boundary lines. The next day, just as I was stacking some boxes in the shed, another car pulled into my driveway. This time it was a man I hadn't met before. He stepped out, dressed in business casual, holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as the HOA compliance officer and said he was there to inspect my property for further violations. I raised an eyebrow. There was nothing in my purchase agreement or any legal document that allowed them to enter my land without permission. When I asked him for the authority to do so, he said, "All properties in this area are under the HOA's jurisdiction." I simply told him, "Not mine," and pointed toward the gate. He looked surprised, maybe even a little nervous. I could see him scanning the yard like he was searching for something to write up, but without stepping inside, he had nothing. He muttered that I'd hear from the board and left. That evening, I got another letter in my mailbox. This one was more aggressive, bold, capitalized text threatening immediate fines if I continued to ignore HOA regulations. They gave me a compliance deadline of 2 weeks to remove any items from their docks and refrain from entering HOA-controlled waters. I didn't even bother getting upset. Instead, I slipped the letter into the growing folder of evidence. Over the next few days, I kept a low profile. I didn't touch the docks, didn't go boating, didn't give them any new excuses to throw at me. But I kept watching. I noticed that members of the HOA used the docks daily, fishing, unloading boats, even hosting small gatherings on them. I also noticed repairs being made, new boards nailed down, fresh paint on the railings, and even a brand new padlock on one of the dock gates. All of this was happening on my water rights zone, without a single request or acknowledgement. The thing was, I wasn't just documenting for the sake of a future argument. I was piecing together a bigger picture, one that would eventually show they had been the ones violating property boundaries, not me. The more they pushed, the deeper they were stepping into a problem they didn't see coming. By the end of the week, I had a stack of letters from them, dozens of photos, and the complete legal proof of my control over the lake section. I could feel the situation building like a storm on the horizon. And just like a storm, I knew it would break suddenly, with them standing right in the middle of it, wondering how it happened. The next weekend, I woke to the sound of loud voices carrying over the water. It was still early, the sun barely peeking over the treeline, but the HOA crew was already out on the docks. I could see them from my porch, 5 or 6 people gathered, pointing toward my cabin like they were planning a military operation. One of them, the tall man I'd seen before, had a roll of caution tape in his hands. Another was jotting notes on a clipboard. I watched for a few minutes before deciding to walk down toward the shoreline. I stayed on my side of the property line, close enough to hear without crossing any boundaries. As I got closer, their conversation became clearer. They were talking about securing the docks and making sure he doesn't have access. The woman in the sun hat was there too, giving orders like she was running a construction crew. Then I saw it. They were actually wrapping the caution tape around one of the dock entrances. A bright yellow barrier, as if they were closing it off for safety reasons. Except there was no real hazard. The dock was fine. This was just another attempt to send a message. Stay away. I couldn't help but smile at their confidence. They still had no idea. Every nail in that dock, every plank they were touching, every so-called barrier they put up was happening inside my water rights zone. It was like watching someone build a fence in the middle of your living room and acting like it was theirs. When they noticed me watching, the tall man called out, "You'll need written permission to use these from now on." I shouted back, "Oh, I'll be sure to keep that in mind," and turned away before they could read my expression. I didn't want them to see that I was already a step ahead. Later that afternoon, a neighbor I hadn't met before stopped by. He was an older gentleman who lived further down the shore, and he seemed cautious, like he wasn't sure if talking to me would get him in trouble. We chatted for a while about the lake, the fishing, and the weather, before he lowered his voice and said, "I've seen the way the HOA's been on you. They've done this before." I asked him what he meant, and he told me that over the years, the HOA had quietly claimed more and more of the lake, putting up signs, issuing fines, and intimidating new property owners until they gave up using certain areas. Most people didn't fight it because they didn't know their exact rights, or they just didn't want the trouble. He shook his head and said, "But if you've got the paperwork, you might be the first one to push back and win." His words stuck with me. It confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't just about me. This was a long-running habit for them. And if they'd been doing it for years, then there was probably a trail of complaints and maybe even old disputes recorded somewhere. That gave me an idea. The next day, I drove into town and stopped by the county records office. It was an old brick building with shelves stacked high with folders, maps, and public archives. I explained to the clerk that I was looking for historical property and water rights records for my section of the lake. She disappeared into the back for a while, and when she returned, she was carrying a thick file. Inside was everything I'd hoped for. Decades-old maps showing the original survey lines, notarized deeds outlining the exact scope of water control, and even a few old disputes between former property owners and the HOA. In every single case, the county had sided with the landowner when the HOA overstepped. The pattern was clear. They had been trying the same tricks for years, and each time someone had solid documentation, the HOA had to back down. I made copies of everything and carefully filed them alongside my own paperwork. Now, not only could I prove my rights, I could show a history of the HOA losing the exact kind of fight they were picking with me. That evening, I walked down to the docks again, just to see what they'd done with all their security measures. The caution tape was still there, fluttering in the breeze. They'd also put up another sign, this one reading, HOA maintenance area, keep out. It was almost funny. Not only were they claiming my space, they were investing time and resources into it without realizing they were building their own problem. As I stood there, I noticed something else. One of the boards near the end of the dock had been replaced. The wood was fresh, the nails still shiny. That meant they'd been making repairs recently. Repairs meant expenses. And expenses meant there would be receipts, logs, or work orders somewhere. I realized I could request those records through the county or, if it came to it, in a legal setting. The fact that they were spending HOA funds on a dock they didn't own would be a hard thing for them to explain to their members. Back at the cabin, I sat at the kitchen table with all my paperwork spread out in front of me. I had the current survey, the water rights deed, the historical records, and now a growing collection of photographs showing their activity on my section of the lake. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. But there was something else I was noticing. They were escalating faster than I expected. Usually, disputes like this start with letters and warnings, then drag on for months before anything physical happens. But these people were already moving to block access and make visible claims over the space. That told me they either felt extremely confident or extremely desperate. I wasn't sure which yet, but I intended to find out. The next morning, I saw a small group gathered on the dock again. This time they had clipboards, measuring tapes, and what looked like blueprint papers. From a distance, it seemed like they were planning some kind of upgrade or construction. I stayed quiet, just watching from my porch, but inside my mind was racing. If they built something permanent, especially without permits, it could give me an even stronger position later. I spent the rest of the day making detailed notes in a small journal I'd started keeping for the situation. Dates, times, descriptions, who was present, everything went in. I even sketched a rough map showing where each new sign and tape barrier had been placed. I wasn't leaving any detail undocumented. By the time the sun went down, I felt oddly calm. They were still moving their pieces on the board, but they had no idea I was quietly recording every single one of their moves. The more they acted, the more evidence I had. And the more evidence I had, the harder it would be for them to fight back when the truth came out. Out on the lake, the yellow caution tape flapped lazily in the evening breeze. The reflection of the docks shimmered on the water, looking harmless and ordinary to anyone else. But I knew better. That calm surface was hiding a brewing storm, one that was getting closer with every day they kept pushing. 2 days later, I woke up to the low rumble of an engine outside. I looked through the blinds and saw a large pickup truck pulling a flatbed trailer stacked with lumber and construction supplies. Behind it, another truck followed with what looked like sections of metal railing and heavy-duty posts. Both vehicles stopped right next to the dock. I grabbed my coffee and stood at the edge of the porch, watching as a small crew hopped out. They started unloading materials, stacking them on the dock like they were gearing up for a big project. The woman in the sun hat arrived a few minutes later, clipboard in hand, directing everyone where to put things. From the way she was smiling and gesturing, it looked like she was proud of whatever they had planned. I could hear snippets of their conversation. Words like extension, private access only, and secured entry floated across the water. I realized they weren't just maintaining the dock, they were expanding it. And from the size of the beams and posts, it wasn't going to be a small addition. They were preparing to make a statement, probably to show me they had the final say over the lake. I leaned against the porch railing, keeping my expression neutral. Inside, though, I was practically laughing. Every plank they nailed, every dollar they spent, was another step deeper into a trap they didn't know existed. I'd already confirmed through county records that they had no legal claim over that section of the water. And now they were about to sink thousands of HOA funds into building on my property rights zone. I decided to take a walk down toward the shoreline, staying firmly on my land, but close enough to see the work. A man in a neon safety vest spotted me and called out, "Careful! This is an active construction area. HOA members only pass this point." I asked him who hired them, and he pointed toward the woman in the sun hat. "She's the project manager," he said, then went back to carrying lumber. When she noticed me, she didn't look pleased. "You're not allowed here during construction," she said, her voice sharp. I reminded her that I was on my own property. She paused for a moment, then said, "Well, you'll still need to follow HOA safety rules when near the dock." I didn't bother arguing. I just pulled out my phone and started taking photos. Every angle, every truck, every worker, all documented. She crossed her arms and muttered something to one of the crew members, but I kept snapping pictures until I had what I needed. By midday, the noise from the hammers and saws echoed across the lake. Boards were laid out in neat rows, metal posts were driven deep into the lakebed, and the skeleton of a new platform began to take shape. I went back to the cabin, opened my folder of evidence, and added the new photos. I also started a separate file just for construction, dates, times, materials, and any comments I overheard. Later that afternoon, I saw the tall man from the first visit arrive in his boat. He tied it to the dock and stepped up to inspect the progress, shaking hands with the crew. They laughed and talked like they were celebrating something. I could imagine what they were thinking. Once this expansion was done, they'd have a bigger, better dock under their control, and I'd be forced to either comply or stay away entirely. They still didn't know they were building on land and water rights they didn't own. That evening, just as the workers were packing up, I noticed a small group of HOA members gathering to admire the construction. Some were taking pictures, others were talking about hosting summer events on the new platform. I stayed far enough away not to be part of their gathering, but I could hear enough to realize this project wasn't just about me. It was a public show of dominance. They wanted the whole neighborhood to see them claim the lake. Once they left, I walked down to the waterline and studied the construction site in the fading light. The new platform extended several feet farther into the water than the old dock, and fresh pilings were lined up, ready to be driven in the next day. I took more photos, making sure to capture the new footprint in relation to my property lines. The next morning, the work started even earlier. I could hear the rhythmic thump of a pile driver before I even got out of bed. By the time I walked outside, they were already setting up railings and securing support beams. I recognized the company name on the side of one of the trucks, so I discreetly snapped a picture. Later, I could contact them for a copy of the work order. One more piece of proof for my case. Around noon, the compliance officer from before showed up. He stood with the woman in the sun hat, looking over the progress and making notes. At one point, he turned and spotted me standing by my porch. He gave me a smirk, like this was his way of showing who had the upper hand. I didn't return the expression. I just kept watching, calm and silent. By the third day of construction, the dock expansion looked nearly complete. Fresh paint gleamed on the railings, the planks were neatly fitted, and a brand new locked gate had been installed at the entrance. They even mounted another, HOA members only sign right in the center, bold and impossible to miss. But they had no idea that the gleaming new structure they were so proud of was sitting entirely on my water rights. No permits, no agreement, no authorization from the actual owner of that section of the lake. That night, I stood on the porch, looking at the moonlit reflection of the new dock. The water was calm, but my mind was buzzing. The time to act was getting closer. I had everything documented: the letters, the false claims, the signs, the construction, and the proof of ownership. Every move they'd made was now on record. For now, I would let them enjoy their new prize. Let them throw their parties, host their fishing tournaments, and brag about their beautiful HOA dock. The more they used it, the deeper their investment would be, and the more satisfying it would be when they finally realized they'd built their centerpiece on property that was never theirs to begin with. 3 days after the construction wrapped up, the HOA wasted no time showing off their new dock. From my porch, I could see a cluster of people gathered at the far end, chairs set up, coolers out, and fishing lines dangling in the water. Laughter carried across the lake, mixed with the faint thump of music from a portable speaker. It was like they were hosting a celebration, just to remind me I wasn't welcome there. I stood with my coffee in hand, watching them like someone watching a stage play. They were so sure of themselves, so proud of this exclusive platform they thought they'd secured. The woman in the sun hat was there too, moving from group to group like a politician at a campaign rally. Every now and then she'd glance toward my cabin, probably to see if I was seething with jealousy. I wasn't, not even close. In fact, I wanted them to keep going. Every day they used that dock, every time they posted photos online or held an event, it was another log on the fire I was quietly building. They were creating a public record of their use, which, combined with my proof of ownership, would be devastating for them later. Mid-morning, I noticed something new. A man with a DSLR camera walking along the dock, snapping professional-looking photos of the structure and the people enjoying it. At first, I thought he might be from the HOA newsletter, but then I overheard one of the guests mention that they were sending pictures to the local newspaper for a community feature. I nearly laughed out loud. If those photos ended up in print with captions claiming HOA ownership, they'd be handing me even more evidence. Later that afternoon, I decided to walk down to my shoreline. I stayed exactly within my property line, but close enough to be seen. A couple of people on the dock noticed me and pointed me out to the sun hat woman. She walked toward the gate, leaned against the railing, and called out, "Enjoying the view?" Her tone dripped with mockery. I just smiled and replied, "Every day." Then I pulled out my phone and started recording a slow pan of the dock, making sure to capture the signs, the people, and the structure itself. She shifted uncomfortably, but didn't say anything else. That evening, as the crowd thinned out, I noticed the tall man, the one who'd been vocal during their first visit, standing with a couple of others, talking about plans to add more seating and maybe even a small boat slip. They were making big, expensive dreams for something they had no right to build in the first place. Over the next week, the dock became a daily hotspot. In the mornings, I'd see people fishing. By afternoons, kids were jumping into the water from the edge. On weekends, it turned into a social hub, with folding tables set up for snacks and drinks. I kept my distance but documented everything: photos, videos, and written notes. Then something happened that made the situation even more interesting. One evening, just as the sun was dipping low, a fishing boat from another part of the lake pulled up to the dock. The driver tied his boat to the new railings and climbed up to join the group. I didn't recognize him, but I noticed the HOA members greeting him warmly and offering drinks. That might not sound important, but here's the thing: he wasn't a resident of the community. I knew because I'd seen his boat docked at the public marina on the opposite shore. If the HOA was letting non-members use the dock, that was a violation of their own bylaws. And if they were allowing people to tie up boats in my section of the lake without my consent, that was even better for my case. I made a note of the boat's registration number and took a few discreet photos from my porch. The following day, I drove into town again and stopped by the local library. I knew they kept archives of the town's small community newspaper. Sure enough, in the most recent issue, there it was, a half-page feature on the HOA's beautiful new dock. There were glossy photos of the structure, smiling residents, and even a quote from the sun hat woman about how the dock is an investment for all members to enjoy for decades to come. I almost couldn't believe my luck. That single article was a public declaration of ownership over something they didn't own. I checked out a copy and scanned it as soon as I got home, adding it to my growing collection of evidence. By the end of that week, the pattern was clear. They were going to treat the dock as their personal property no matter what. And they were going to get bolder. I saw them bringing in more furniture, installing solar lights along the railing, and even setting up a locked storage box for fishing gear. All of it paid for with HOA funds, all of it on my water rights. One afternoon, while I was organizing my notes, the older gentleman who'd warned me before stopped by again. He leaned against the porch post and said, "You know, they think they're untouchable. Nobody's ever stood up to them and won. But I think you might be the first." I told him I wasn't rushing into anything. I wanted them to dig as deep as possible before I made my move. He grinned and said, "Smart. The deeper the hole, the harder it is to climb out." The next weekend, the HOA held what looked like a full-on party on the dock. Balloons, music, tables full of food. I could hear the laughter all the way from my cabin. At one point, they even had a small portable grill set up, with the smell of burgers drifting across the water. I stood by my window, watching them live it up, completely unaware that they were building the perfect case against themselves. As the sun set, I noticed a detail that made me pause. They'd strung a banner across the gate reading, "HOA Dock Opening Celebration." I snapped a photo so fast I almost dropped my phone. That banner wasn't just decoration. It was a clear, dated acknowledgement of their claim. By the time the party wrapped up, I had a camera roll full of gold. The banner, the guests, the locked gate, the furniture, the lights, everything. I filed it all away, feeling the same quiet satisfaction I'd felt from day one. They thought they were winning. They thought I was just sitting back, sulking on the sidelines while they enjoyed their prize. But in reality, every single day they touched that dock, they were making my eventual win bigger, louder, and impossible for them to wriggle out of. And I wasn't going to stop them. Not yet. The HOA president stepped closer, her voice sharp, almost shaking with irritation as she repeated the same demand for the fifth time that day. She kept saying the lake was community property, and I had no right to use it as if it were mine. I didn't raise my voice, but I stood my ground, asking her simple questions she couldn't seem to answer. Who had actually bought the land? Who paid the taxes? Who was responsible for its upkeep? She either dodged the questions or acted like I was being difficult, which only made her look more flustered. The group behind her shuffled uncomfortably, clearly realizing this wasn't going the way they had planned. I could see the uncertainty in their eyes, like they were suddenly wondering if their own HOA leaders had been telling them the whole truth about this place. Still, they didn't back down. One man in a faded baseball cap stepped forward, trying to intimidate me with his size. He said something about calling their lawyer, but I calmly reminded him that my lawyer's office was less than 10 minutes away. That made him pause, because I said it with the kind of confidence you only have when you know you're holding all the cards. I could feel the shift in the air. They wanted me to crack, to give in, but I wasn't going to. I knew exactly what I owned, and I also knew something they didn't. Every single one of their precious docks was built on my water rights. That thought almost made me smile, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I kept letting them talk, listening as they threw around half-true claims about bylaws and shared access. I let them dig themselves deeper into a hole, saying things that could later be disproved with one simple document. It was almost like watching people argue in the dark without realizing the lights could be turned on at any second. Their voices got louder, their points more desperate, but all I had to do was stand still and let the moment play out. One of the HOA board members tried to corner me by saying they had historical access to the lake, and that made it theirs. I calmly asked if they had ever paid for any repairs to the shoreline or handled any permits for the docks. That shut him down faster than I expected. He looked at the others, maybe hoping someone else would jump in and rescue him, but nobody did. The silence was almost better than any argument I could have made. They didn't realize it yet, but their own words were building my case for me. I noticed a couple of the residents stepping back from the group, like they didn't want to be part of this confrontation anymore. That told me more than anything else that cracks were starting to form. The HOA's power here wasn't absolute. It was based on people's belief in their authority. And once people saw that authority questioned, even for a moment, it started to crumble. All I had to do was keep the pressure steady and let them reveal the truth themselves. After about 20 minutes, their tone shifted from aggressive demands to uneasy threats. They said they'd look into the matter and review the records before taking further action. I knew exactly what that meant. They were going back to double-check if what they'd just claimed could actually hold up. The thing was, I already knew the answer, and it wasn't in their favor. The lake, the shoreline, and the submerged land under those docks were all in my name. Every nail, every plank, every rope tied to those floating platforms, all of it rested on property I owned outright. As they turned to leave, I couldn't help but notice how different their body language was from when they arrived. They had stormed in like they were going to put me in my place, but now they were walking away slower, heads a little lower. The sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel path was almost satisfying. They didn't say goodbye, didn't shake hands, didn't even make eye contact. It was the kind of exit that told me they knew this wasn't over, but not in the way they had planned. When the last of them disappeared down the path, I finally let myself take a deep breath. I walked to the edge of the lake and looked out at the docks stretching into the water. The sunlight was bouncing off the surface, and in that moment, I thought about how much those docks meant to the people who used them every day. They were more than just wooden platforms. They were the heart of summer weekends, fishing trips, and neighborhood gatherings. The HOA didn't see them that way. They saw them as leverage, as a way to control who belonged and who didn't. But they had made one big mistake. They didn't realize they'd built their power on land they didn't own. I crouched down near the shoreline, letting the water lap at my boots, and thought about my next move. The HOA thought this confrontation was about access to the lake, but I was already thinking several steps ahead. I wasn't going to just defend what was mine. I was going to make sure they understood exactly where their boundaries ended. And the best part, I didn't need to raise my voice, slam any doors, or start a shouting match. All I needed was the truth, a few key documents, and the patience to watch them unravel. The wind picked up slightly, and I could hear the creak of one of the older docks as it swayed with the current. It reminded me that time was on my side. Every day that passed without them knowing the full picture was a day I could use to prepare. The HOA had made the first move, but in doing so, they'd revealed their entire strategy. And me? I was just getting started. The news about my ownership spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By the time I stepped out the next morning, I could feel the shift in the air. The same people who had marched up to my porch demanding their lake were now avoiding eye contact. A few whispered to each other when I passed. Some pretended to be busy trimming hedges or checking mail, just so they didn't have to meet my eyes. It was almost funny, considering how bold they'd been just days earlier. I didn't have to say a word. The reality of the situation was working on them like a slow, steady tide. They were realizing that the person they'd tried to push around was the one holding all the cards, literally holding the deeds, permits, and water rights in black and white. The same docks they enjoyed for years without a second thought now felt borrowed. And the person they'd have to ask permission from was me. It didn't take long for the first friendly visit to happen. One of the HOA board members, someone who had been especially loud the first day, showed up at my door with a forced smile and a basket of muffins. They acted like the whole confrontation had been a big misunderstanding. "We just want to keep good relations," they said. I listened, but I didn't let them think it was all water under the bridge. I reminded them, politely but firmly, that the docks were now under my direct oversight, and any activity on the lake required my consent. Their smile tightened, but they nodded. The funny part? Within a week, the HOA sent out an official notice to the residents, written in overly polite legal language, basically acknowledging that all lake and dock use was subject to property owner's approval. That property owner was me. I could imagine the gritted teeth behind that letter. Meanwhile, I started receiving calls from individual homeowners. Some wanted to smooth things over, others wanted to negotiate special access, and a few even tried to hint that I should just hand over the rights to keep things simple. I didn't bite. I wasn't interested in giving up something that was mine, not after the way they had treated me from day one. But I wasn't out to be a tyrant either. I decided to set up a system where neighbors could apply for dock use permits through me directly. It was fair, organized, and on my terms. Of course, the HOA hated it, but they couldn't stop it. In fact, some of their own members came to me quietly, bypassing the board altogether, because they didn't want to deal with the politics. That part amused me to no end. The more control I exercised, the clearer it became that the power dynamic had flipped completely. People who once thought they could bully me were now asking for my approval. I kept things professional, but I never forgot how quickly they'd turned hostile when they thought they had the upper hand. Months passed, and the relationship between me and the HOA became complicated. They tried to save face in public, acting as though we had reached a mutual understanding. But everyone knew I was the one calling the shots when it came to the lake. Their dock maintenance schedules had to go through me. Their community events by the water needed my signature. Even their boat launch times had to align with my permissions. It wasn't revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I just quietly, methodically, made sure they understood that I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my control. The same rules they once tried to use against me were now being enforced in ways they never imagined, and I stayed well within my legal rights the entire time. By the time the first summer rolled around, things had completely shifted. Families who once gave me cold stares were now waving when they saw me on the shore. Some even brought gifts or offered help with small repairs, hoping to stay on my good side. I didn't mind. It was a sign they had finally accepted the new reality. But I'll be honest, there was a certain satisfaction in standing on my porch, looking out at that lake, knowing every inch of it was mine to control. Every dock, every boat, every event, it all passed through me first. And it all started because the HOA thought they could storm into my home and push me around. They had no idea that the moment they tried to take my lake, they were handing me the keys to their own backyard. If they had treated me with respect from the start, maybe things would have turned out differently. But they didn't. And now, every time they step onto those docks, they're reminded of exactly who they're dealing with.